For roughly 60 years in the 10th century, a single Roman noblewoman and her daughter held more influence over the Catholic Church than most popes in history. The Holy See, the spiritual throne of Christendom, the seat of God's representative on earth, became something closer to a family inheritance, passed between men chosen not by divine providence, but by a matriarch with excellent political instincts and zero patience for independence. Historians would later call this period the pornocracy, which sounds sensational, but is honestly underselling it. The Theophylact clan didn't corrupt the papacy from the outside. They moved in, redecorated, and started signing the paperwork. So how does one aristocratic Roman family quietly absorb an institution that claims authority over the souls of every Christian on earth, and hold it for 2 centuries before anyone manages to take it back? In the year 931, a young man sat on the throne of St. Peter and signed papal documents at his mother's request. His name was John the 11th. He was, depending on the source, somewhere between 20 and 25 years old. His mother was Marozia, senator of Rome, and she had arranged the whole thing. Not metaphorically. Quite literally arranged it the way you might arrange a dinner party, except the centerpiece was the spiritual leader of Western Christendom. Take a moment to appreciate that image. The holiest office in the medieval world, the seat of apostolic succession, the chair from which popes had crowned emperors and excommunicated kings. And sitting in it, her son. This was not an accident. This was a business decision. Marozia came from the Theophylact family, a Roman aristocratic clan that had spent the better part of the 9th century quietly accumulating land, titles, and influenced the way other families accumulated furniture. By the early 900s, they did not merely influence the papacy. They operated it. Between roughly 900 and 1100, historians count somewhere between a dozen and 24 popes with direct or indirect ties to this single family. Some were relatives. Some were allies. Some were simply men who understood that Theophylact approval was the only resume that mattered. The incense in St. Peter's Basilica would have smelled the same as always, thick and sweet, designed to suggest the presence of the divine. The candlelight still flickered across golden mosaics. Monks still bent over parchment in cold scriptoria, quills scratching out papal bulls that would reshape European law and theology. The silk vestments were still impossibly heavy with embroidery, cloth of gold stiff with ambition. Everything looked precisely as it should. That was rather the point. Later historians, specifically Protestant writers of the 16th century looking for ammunition against Rome, would give this era a memorable name: the pornocracy, from the Greek word for harlot. Pointed, polemical, and not entirely fair to the women involved, who were, whatever else they were, genuinely formidable political operators. The term stuck anyway, because history has always preferred a scandalous label to a complicated one. But here is the quieter, more unsettling thesis underneath all the scandal. The Catholic Church in this period was not corrupted by some dramatic external assault. No invading army captured the papacy. No heretic stormed the gates. What happened was slower and more instructive. A single family simply paid attention while everyone else was busy praying. They accumulated leverage, cultivated loyalty, placed the right men in the right rooms, and kept doing it long enough that their control became indistinguishable from tradition. No institution is too sacred to be captured when no one is watching. That is not a medieval lesson. That is a human one. The Theophylact family did not begin with Marozia, of course. The foundations were laid earlier by harder hands in bloodier rooms. To understand how a mother could crown her son pope, we need to meet the man who built the machine she inherited. By the 9th century, Rome's population had collapsed to roughly 30,000 souls, rattling around inside a city the ancient emperors had built for 1 million. Think about that arithmetic for a moment. The aqueducts that once carried millions of gallons daily into bathhouses and fountains had gone dry or collapsed entirely. The marble forums, the triumphal arches, the grand colonnaded avenues, all of it still standing, more or less, but repurposed now in the way only desperate people repurpose things. Noble families bricked up the arches of ancient theaters and called them home. The Colosseum served as a quarry, a fortress, and probably a very drafty apartment complex. Rome smelled, in all likelihood, of animal dung and wood smoke and the particular mildew of buildings that had not been maintained in 400 years. This was the city the Pope ran. Not spiritually, literally. After the Western Empire's collapse, the Bishop of Rome had gradually absorbed administrative functions the emperors left behind, collecting taxes, settling disputes, organizing grain supplies, negotiating with the various armies that kept wandering through Italy with opinions about who should govern. By the 800s, the Pope was the closest thing Rome had to a functioning government, and everyone from local farmers to Byzantine diplomats treated him accordingly, which made the office extraordinarily attractive to men with no interest whatsoever in theology. The Carolingian Empire had once provided a counterweight. Charlemagne's alliance with the papacy created a kind of mutual protection arrangement. The Pope granted divine legitimacy, the Franks supplied soldiers. It was, for a time, a workable arrangement. Then Charlemagne died in 814, and his grandsons immediately began destroying everything he had built. The Treaty of Verdun in 843 carved the empire into 3 pieces along lines that satisfied no one completely and exhausted everyone continuously. The Frankish military umbrella over central Italy became increasingly theoretical. Then it became a memory. Then it became a topic for nostalgic clerics to mention in letters. The secular vacuum this created in central Italy was not subtle. It was a gaping, visible absence of authority that local strongmen could feel in their bones the way you feel a drop temperature. Whoever controlled Rome controlled the papacy. Whoever controlled the papacy controlled the most legitimate political institution left standing between the Alps and Sicily. It was, in the language of a later era, an uncontested market. And into that market, in the final decades of the 9th century, walked one man with the organizational instincts of a general and the patience of someone who understood that real power is never seized. It is accumulated quietly over years. His name was Theophylact. Theophylact arrived in the historical record already powerful, which is the most Roman thing imaginable. By the early 900s, he held 3 titles simultaneously: Vestararius, meaning keeper of the papal treasury; Magister Militum, commanding the military garrison that kept order in Rome's streets; and Senator Romanorum, a title so ancient and resonant that simply holding it announced ambition at a volume everyone could hear. Consider what those 3 positions actually meant in practical terms. The man who controls the money knows who needs it. The man who controls the soldiers knows who to frighten. And the man with the most prestigious civic title in the city knows exactly how to make both of those facts look respectable. Theophylact did not accumulate these roles by accident. He collected them the way a careful person collects keys. He also made an exceptionally shrewd marriage. Theodora was not a woman history has been kind enough to fully document, which is its own kind of injustice, because every account we have suggests she was at minimum equally responsible for what followed. A Roman noblewoman of considerable personal wealth, and by contemporary accounts, considerable personal will, she appears to have understood the family's strategy at every step. Together they built something Rome had not seen in quite this form. A household that functioned simultaneously as a treasury, a military headquarters, and an unofficial electoral commission for the most powerful religious office in the Western world. Charming dinner guests, presumably. The mechanism was almost elegant. No pope could be safely elected without financial resources for his administration, and Theophylact controlled those resources. No pope could govern Rome without some assurance the garrison would not simply evict him, and Theophylact controlled the garrison. The cardinals and clergy who technically conducted papal elections were not coerced, exactly. They simply operated in an environment where every available resource belonged to one family, and where making the wrong choice had a way of becoming immediately, physically inconvenient. The opening Theophylact needed arrived courtesy of everyone else's catastrophic behavior. The years following the infamous Cadaver Synod of 897, in which Pope Stephen VI had his predecessor's corpse literally dug up and put on trial, had left the papacy in a condition that could generously be described as unstable. Several popes were elected, deposed, strangled, or simply died under circumstances that invited questions. Rome was exhausted, fractured, and desperate for something resembling order. Theophylact provided that order in 904 by engineering the election of Sergius III. Sergius was not a sentimental man. He had actually been present at the Cadaver Synod as a supporter of the prosecution, which tells you something about his political instincts. More relevantly, he owed his election entirely to Theophylact's support, and he appears to have understood the terms of that debt with perfect clarity. The papal chair was occupied. The family's candidate sat in it. And from that arrangement, an entire dynasty's logic would follow. The house of Theophylact had not conquered the papacy. They had simply made themselves indispensable to it, which is a more durable achievement and considerably harder to prosecute. What it produced next was a figure so controversial that medieval chroniclers invented a special term of contempt just to describe the era she created. Theodora allegedly looked at a promising young clergyman named John and decided he would make an excellent pope, which is either a love story or a hostile acquisition depending on your sympathies. The year was around 914. John, already Bishop of Bologna, was elevated to Pope John X under circumstances that the chronicler Liutprand of Cremona could not resist describing in the most salacious terms available to a 10th century bishop with a grudge. According to Liutprand, Theodora had taken John as a lover and used her considerable influence to drag him from Bologna to Rome and install him on the throne of St. Peter. Whether the affair was real or a rhetorical weapon is genuinely impossible to say. What is not in dispute is that John X became pope, that the Theophylact family supported his elevation, and that Liutprand despised everyone involved with a passion that should always make a historian slightly nervous about his objectivity. Liutprand is, unfortunately, our primary source for most of what follows. He wrote with the Baroque enthusiasm of someone who considered accuracy a secondary virtue, and he aimed most of his venom specifically at women who held power, which tells you a great deal about the era's anxieties. His term for this period, pornocracy, meaning the rule of harlots, has stuck in the historical record for over 1,000 years. It is worth pausing on that. The same concentration of power that earned Theophylact adjectives like influential and capable earned Theodora and her daughter something considerably less printable: The word itself is a gendered verdict dressed as historical analysis. The daughter in question was Marozia, and she was, by any honest accounting, one of the most formidable political operators of the early medieval period. She appears to have begun her political education early. Her alleged liaison with Pope Sergius III, her family's original papal candidate, produced a son, according to persistent contemporary rumor, who would eventually become Pope John XI. If true, that means a woman arranged for her son to occupy the same office his father had held. The papacy as a family business had taken on an almost literal meaning. Marozia married 3 times, and each marriage was a strategic calculation rather than a romantic gesture. First came Alberic I of Spoleto, who brought military muscle and territorial reach. When he died, she married Guy of Tuscany, consolidating her position in central Italian politics with the calm efficiency of someone rearranging furniture. Then, most ambitiously, she pursued Hugh of Italy, a king, which would have made her effectively a queen with one hand resting on the papal throne. The ambition is almost architectural in its scale. But before that third marriage, Marozia managed something her father had only implied was possible. Around 928 or 929, Pope John X, the man her mother had allegedly elevated 14 years earlier, died in custody. Marozia had him arrested. He was imprisoned in the Castel Sant'Angelo, that great circular fortress on the Tiber that has hosted more than its share of people having very bad years. The exact cause of death remains uncertain. Suffocation is among the theories. The papacy had gone from being the family's prize to being, in some sense, their jurisdiction. Imagine holding that much power in a world that had no legitimate language for a woman who held it. No title existed for what Marozia actually was. The chroniclers who recorded her actions could only reach for moral condemnation because the vocabulary of political authority simply did not extend to her gender. She was not a queen, not a regent, not a senator. She was, by the record's own admission, the woman who put popes in their chairs and took them out again. And the best her contemporaries could manage was a word that was really just an insult with Latin roots. The third marriage to Hugh of Italy would bring Marozia to the edge of something that looked remarkably like complete control. It would also bring someone else into the room who had inherited her talent for timing and absolutely no interest in sharing the stage. The Castel Sant'Angelo did not become the most important building in medieval European politics by accident. It started as a tomb, built around 139 by Emperor Hadrian to house his own remains, which is a very Roman way of saying that even in death, you want the best real estate in the city. By the 10th century, whoever garrisoned that fortress controlled the bridge across the Tiber. And whoever controlled the bridge controlled access to St. Peter's Basilica. And whoever controlled access to St. Peter's Basilica could, with a modest show of armed enthusiasm, determine which candidate the assembled clergy found most spiritually compelling. Here is how a papal election actually worked in this period before the later conclave reforms locked the cardinals in a room and removed the catering until they reached a decision. The clergy of Rome would gather. The laity would weigh in. Aristocratic factions would make their preferences known, sometimes through prayer, more often through the visible presence of armed men in the immediate vicinity. The candidate with the most robust support, which is to say the most swords and the most gold, tended to emerge with the papal office. The Holy Spirit was credited. The Theophylact family took notes. The Lateran Palace, the Pope's actual residence, completed the picture. Control the fortress, control the palace, and you have bracketed the entire institution between 2 points of leverage. It is not so different, in structural terms, from a private equity firm placing allies on a board of directors, or a well-funded interest group seating a regulatory agency with sympathetic appointees over the course of several administrations. The mechanism is surprisingly transferable across centuries. The window dressing changes. The math does not. Bribery was charitably ubiquitous. Promises of appointment, land grants, and protection flowed toward wavering electors with the warm inevitability of Roman sunlight. Armed retainers waited outside. The candidate who arrived with Marozia's blessing arrived with all of it: the gold, the soldiers, the fortress at his back, and the implicit understanding that the alternative was considerably less comfortable. What made this system so elegantly capturable was that it wore the language of sacred tradition while operating entirely on secular logic. Each election looked like a spiritual discernment. Each election was, in practice, a transaction dressed in vestments. The family had not broken the institution. They had simply learned to speak its language while writing their own rules. And that arrangement held more or less until the people enforcing it began to disagree among themselves about who exactly was in charge. Which brings us to Marozia's son. Alberic II was approximately 17 years old when he threw his mother in prison and took over Rome, which is either a testament to his decisive political instincts or a very uncomfortable family dinner taken to its logical conclusion. The year was 932. Hugh of Italy, Marozia's new husband, had made the tactical error of slapping young Alberic across the face during a banquet. The exact reason varies by account, but the consequences were not ambiguous. Alberic walked out of the feast, raised the Roman populace with a speech about foreign domination and the city's humiliated dignity, and returned with enough armed support to seize the Castel San Angelo before Hugh could organize a response. Hugh fled. Marozia, the woman who had commanded popes and fortresses and 2 decades of political machinery, was locked in a cell. She would not emerge for the rest of her life. There is something genuinely cinematic about it. The torches, the shouting crowds, the gates closing. The woman who had built the golden cage discovering with some finality that she was inside it. What followed was, by the standards of 10th century Rome, something approaching competent government. Alberic ruled for 22 years as princeps and senator of the Romans, a title he constructed carefully to signal authority without technically crowding out the papacy's spiritual role. He was, in other words, a man who understood branding. The Pope handled theology. Alberic handled everything else, including the Pope. During his tenure, he appointed 4 consecutive popes, cycling through them with the calm efficiency of a man replacing middle management. Sergius IV, Leo VII, Stephen VIII, Marinus II. Each emerged from the process with Alberic's approval and the understanding that the temporal arrangements of the city were not their department. Here is the irony that historians cannot quite stop smiling about. Alberic, son of Marozia, grandson of Theodora, scion of the most aggressively secular dynasty in papal history, became a genuine patron of the Cluniac monastic reform movement. He invited reformed monastics to Rome. He funded houses of genuine spiritual rigor. The family that had treated the papacy as a municipal utility was now bankrolling the people trying to clean it up. Whether this reflected personal conviction, political calculation, or a very sophisticated sense of humor is a question the sources decline to answer cleanly. Don't worry. He still found a way to make it strange at the end. On his deathbed in 954, Alberic summoned the Roman nobility to his side and extracted an oath. When the papal throne next fell vacant, they would elect his son Octavian as pope. His teenage son. His son, who already held secular titles and whose qualifications were, let us say, primarily genealogical. The nobles swore. Because you did not tell a dying Alberic no, and you certainly did not tell him yes and then do something different, not with the city's garrison still loyal to his name. The room smelled of incense and inevitability. The candles burned low. And somewhere in the arrangement of that deathbed oath, an entirely new problem was being born, one that would eventually require the rest of the medieval church to respond. Which, as it turns out, it eventually did. Octavian was approximately 18 years old when he became the most powerful religious figure in Western Christendom, which tells you something useful about what the title actually meant in 955. He took the name John XII, making him one of the first popes in history to formally adopt a regnal name distinct from his own, a small, bureaucratic detail that would eventually become standard practice for every successor to the throne of St. Peter. That is the generous interpretation of his legacy. It gets more colorful from there. The Lateran Palace, ancient seat of papal authority, had hosted councils and saints and some of the most consequential theological debates in Christian history. Under John XII, contemporaries accused it of hosting rather different activities. The charges leveled against him at his eventual trial read less like ecclesiastical misconduct and more like the plot of a theatrical farce that nobody's mother should see. Adultery multiple times with multiple women. Gambling. Invoking the devil during toasts. An atmosphere at the Lateran that his critics described in terms that required the scribes, presumably blushing, to reach for their most euphemistic Latin. The air quality was, spiritually speaking, noticeable. Whether every charge was literally true is a fair question. Church trials had political dimensions, and the people writing the accusations had excellent reasons to make John look catastrophic. But enough detail survives from enough independent sources that historians tend to conclude something was happening at the Lateran, and it was not Vespers. Here is where John accidentally changed the map of Europe. Feeling threatened by Berengar II of Italy, who was pressing uncomfortably on Roman territory, John made the kind of decision you make when you are 18 and certain a foreign army is the solution. He invited Otto I of Germany to come south and help. Otto came. Otto helped. And on the 2nd of February 962, in St. Peter's Basilica, John XII placed the imperial crown on Otto's head, creating what would become the Holy Roman Empire. It seemed like an alliance. It was actually a leash, and John had handed over one end. Otto expected the papal office to behave itself. When John, apparently incapable of this, began conspiring against him almost immediately, Otto returned to Rome in 963 and convened a synod. John was tried in absentia because he had sensibly fled the city. He was deposed. A new pope was installed. For the first time in over a century, someone outside the family had dictated who sat on St. Peter's throne. John returned briefly after Otto left, dealt harshly with those who had cooperated with the proceedings, and then, in 964, died in a manner his enemies found almost gratifyingly symbolic. The story, recorded by the Bishop Liutprand of Cremona with what reads as barely concealed delight, is that a Roman husband found John in circumstances that made further explanation unnecessary and responded with the kind of violence that precluded any papal recovery. John XII was approximately 27. He had crowned an emperor, scandalized a continent, and handed future reformers enough material to last generations. The family still had the city for now, but the walls had developed a crack, and outside them, Otto I was already thinking about the papacy's future management. The Ottonian privilege, signed in 962, gave the Holy Roman Emperor something the Theophylact family had spent a century assuming nobody else could claim: the right to approve or reject any papal election before it took effect. On paper, this was a constitutional revolution. In practice, it was an invitation to a very long argument. The argument lasted decades. Otto and his successors installed their own candidates, extracted oaths, deposed inconvenient pontiffs, and generally treated the papal office like a frontier province that kept electing the wrong governor. The family, to their credit, adapted. They had not survived Roman politics this long by being rigid. A Theophylact offshoot, the Crescenti, stepped into the chaos of the late 10th century with the quiet confidence of people who had been watching this game since before the current players were born. Through the 980s and 990s, they managed a rotating cast of imperial and anti-imperial popes with the kind of calm efficiency that comes from having done exactly this before under a different family name. When the emperor installed a pope the Crescenti disliked, they waited. When that pope died, they suggested replacements. The Lateran throne changed hands with dizzying frequency during this period, and somehow the Crescenti were always more or less involved in the transaction. But the main branch of the family was not finished. They had simply taken time to rebrand. By the early 11th century, the Theophylact descendants had reinvented themselves as the Counts of Tusculum, a title that came with a fortified hill town southeast of Rome and considerably better optics than their recent history might have suggested they deserved. They were landed nobility now, respectable, reformed in presentation if not entirely in method. The papacy was still a family business. They had merely updated the letterhead. Between roughly 1012 and 1046, the Counts of Tusculum placed 3 of their own on the throne of St. Peter in more or less direct succession. Benedict VIII, John XIX, and Benedict IX held the papal office between them for the better part of 3.5 decades. This was, even by Theophylact standards, remarkably concentrated. Benedict IX deserves his own chapter, and he will get one. He was appointed pope at an age that historians still politely debate, and managed to be deposed, restored, and replaced with such frequency that Rome briefly had 3 simultaneous claimants to the papacy. Which, even for the 11th century, was a lot. The empire had struck back. The family had simply learned to duck and return swinging. Benedict VIII arrived at the papal throne in 1012 already holding a sword, which was unusual, and would use it, which was more unusual still. Born Theophylact of Tusculum, he came to power the way his family had always preferred, through a combination of political maneuvering and the convenient absence of serious competition. But unlike some of his ancestors who had treated the papacy primarily as a revenue stream with a nice hat, Benedict VIII turned out to have genuine administrative gifts. He formed military alliances, led campaigns against Saracen raiders threatening the southern coast, and won a significant naval engagement at the mouth of the Liris River in 1016. The Bishop of Rome was out here commanding fleets. The irony of a warrior pope born from the most corrupt family in papal history seemed lost on nobody except, perhaps, Benedict himself. He died in 1024, having left the church measurably more stable than he found it, which was a low bar, but he cleared it with room to spare. His brother cleared no bars whatsoever. John the 19th succeeded him immediately, as brothers so often did in this family. The transition raised one rather significant procedural concern. John was a layman. He had no clerical orders, no theological training, and by multiple contemporary accounts, had purchased his elevation through outright bribery. Rome, apparently undeterred, ordained him and consecrated him on the same day. Imagine that, the ecclesiastical equivalent of hiring someone with no degree, no experience, and visible cash in hand, and then scheduling their graduation and their first day of work for the same Tuesday afternoon. John reigned until 1032, which was long enough to collect considerable criticism and not quite long enough to do anything particularly memorable. When he died, the family had one more candidate ready. Benedict IX was probably around 20 years old when he became pope. Some historians argue he may have been younger. The Catholic Church has chosen, wisely, not to commit firmly to a number. He was, by most accounts, spectacularly unsuited to the office. Contemporary chroniclers described his behavior with the kind of breathless horror usually reserved for natural disasters. He survived one attempted assassination, weathered multiple Roman revolts, and was driven from the city at least once by a population that had genuinely had enough. Then in 1045, Benedict did something no pope had ever done before or has managed since. He sold the papacy. His godfather, a reformist priest named John Gratian, paid him a sum so enormous that contemporaries described it with audible disbelief, possibly over 1,000 pounds of silver in exchange for Benedict's resignation. John Gratian became Gregory VI, a pope whose sincere reforming intentions were immediately overshadowed by the fact that he had technically purchased his position. The situation then became, structurally speaking, a nightmare. Benedict reclaimed the throne. A previous claimant named Sylvester III reappeared. For a brief, spectacular moment, Rome had three men simultaneously calling themselves pope, each with supporters, each with grievances, each almost certainly exhausting to be around. The empire, watching from the north, began making travel arrangements, which is where the story goes next. Henry III of the Holy Roman Empire arrived in Italy in the autumn of 1046 looking like a man who had made a decision and was no longer interested in discussion. He was 22 years old, deeply pious, and possessed of something the Roman Church had not encountered in quite some time: genuine moral outrage that came with an army attached. The sight of three men simultaneously claiming to be the Vicar of Christ had been, for Henry, the final evidence that Italian church governance required outside supervision. He crossed the Alps with a clear agenda and the military weight to enforce it. December of 1046. The small town of Sutri, north of Rome, in the chill of an Italian winter. Bishops assembled. The emperor presided. The air inside that council chamber must have felt close, formal, and faintly dangerous, the way rooms feel when everyone present knows something irreversible is about to happen. Sylvester III was first. He was declared an illegal claimant and deposed without particular ceremony. Gregory VI, the reformer who had purchased his way in with good intentions and poor judgment, fared no better. When the evidence of his transaction was presented, Gregory apparently acknowledged the whole arrangement and resigned, which was almost refreshingly honest by the standards of the era. Benedict IX, absent and unrepentant, was deposed in absentia. The three-pope problem, which had seemed almost impossible to resolve, was resolved in roughly the time it takes to hold a meeting. Henry then appointed Suiger, the German bishop of Bamberg, as pope. Suiger took the name Clement II. He consecrated Henry as Holy Roman Emperor days later, which suggested that everyone understood the arrangement perfectly well. Here is the irony that the Theophylact Tusculan family could not have anticipated when they began their long monopoly on the throne of St. Peter. Their spectacular dysfunction had handed reformers exactly the justification they needed. 2 centuries of family control had produced warrior popes, teenage popes, and a man who sold his office like a piece of property. The argument for structural change practically wrote itself. The Gregorian reform movement, named for the later Pope Gregory VII, grew directly from this moment. Its premise was straightforward and its implications were enormous. The church should govern itself, and emperors, kings, and Roman aristocratic families should have no role in determining who became pope. The sale of church offices, a practice called simony, would be condemned. Clerical marriages would be prohibited. And most significantly, the mechanism of papal election would be fundamentally redesigned. That redesign arrived in 1059 under Pope Nicholas II. The decree he issued that year created something that still exists, the College of Cardinals. From that point forward, the election of a pope would belong exclusively to the cardinal bishops of the church. No emperor could appoint. No noble family could purchase. No Roman mob could install their preferred candidate by showing up in sufficient numbers with sufficient enthusiasm. The Tusculan family had held the papacy for roughly 200 years through a combination of money, violence, political inheritance, and the structural absence of any rule that said they couldn't. Nicholas II closed that door and bricked over the frame. Imagine sitting in that family's Tusculum stronghold in 1059, reading the new decree. All those investments. All those careful marriages and calculated bribes and dynastic maneuvering. An entire system, 2 centuries in the making, made procedurally impossible by a single document. The Theophylacts had treated the church like a hereditary estate, and in a sense they were not wrong to do so, because for a very long time, nobody had written down a rule saying otherwise. Now someone had. The papacy that emerged from the Gregorian reform was an institution determined to be independent, universal, and structurally resistant to the exact kind of capture the Tusculan dynasty had perfected. Whether it achieved those goals, completely and permanently, is a question that the next several centuries of papal history will answer with considerable enthusiasm. Pope Nicholas II's decree of 1059 was, on paper, airtight. Cardinal bishops alone would select the next pope. The document was clear, the intention was serious, and the Roman aristocracy was, in theory, out of the business of pontiff production. In practice, the decree had the structural integrity of a very confident promise made at a party. The deeper struggle playing out beneath the surface was something historians call the investiture controversy, and it is exactly as dry a name as it sounds for something that nearly tore medieval Europe in half. The core question was this: who had the right to appoint church officials? Emperors and kings had spent generations handing out bishops' rings and staffs to men of their choosing, binding the church to the nobility through ceremony and mutual convenience. The reformers wanted that stopped entirely. Pope Gregory VII and Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV spent years locked in a confrontation so bitter that Henry famously stood barefoot in the snow outside Canossa in 1077, waiting for Gregory to lift his excommunication. A pope had made an emperor shiver in the cold. That is a sentence that would have been genuinely unthinkable 1 century earlier. The Concordat of Worms in 1122 finally separated the two powers, at least formally. The church would control spiritual appointments. Secular rulers would control temporal arrangements. A clean line. Neat in the document, considerably messier in reality. The conclave system, formalized at the Second Council of Lyon in 1274, added the next layer of insulation. Cardinals would now be locked together in sealed rooms until they produced a decision. No outside contact. No extended negotiations with powerful patrons. A great deal of bad air, dwindling food, and eventually a pope. The word conclave comes from the Latin for with a key. The reformers had locked the door from the inside and swallowed the key. The intention was magnificent. And then came Rodrigo Borgia, elected Alexander VI in 1492 through a campaign of bribery so thorough and cheerful that contemporaries simply marveled at the craftsmanship. Then came Giovanni de' Medici, who became Leo X in 1513, representing a Florentine banking family whose fingerprints were on most of European finance. Then his cousin, Giulio de' Medici, who became Clement VII in 1523. 2 Medici popes within a decade. The family had simply updated the methodology. The Tusculan dynasty had captured the papacy through Roman muscle and inheritance. The Borgias used gold. The Medicis used cultural prestige and strategic generosity accumulated over generations of Florentine banking. The office was the same. The vulnerability was the same. Only the family name had changed. Here is the uncomfortable conclusion that 200 years of reform gradually produced. The papacy was always going to be the most powerful religious office in the Western world, and powerful offices attract powerful families the way candles attract things that would rather not think too carefully about the flame. The locks on the door were real. So were the people who kept finding the windows. Which brings us, naturally, to what the papacy itself was actually worth, and why dynasties across centuries kept deciding it was worth the trouble. The Theophylact family did not think they were corrupting anything. That is the part worth sitting with. Theophylact of Tusculum was a Roman administrator managing real problems in a turbulent city. His daughter Marozia was genuinely capable, genuinely powerful, and operating in a world where capable women had exactly one reliable mechanism for exercising influence. His grandsons, who eventually occupied the throne of St. Peter, were, by the standards of their moment, reasonable candidates. The family did not arrive with a manifesto announcing their intention to hollow out an institution. They simply moved into the available space, and the available space happened to be the most sacred office in Christendom. This is how institutional capture actually works. Not through dramatic villainy. Through proximity, normalization, and the slow erosion of the imaginative capacity to picture things being otherwise. Consider the modern version. A regulatory agency hires its staff from the industry it oversees, because those are the people with relevant expertise. A university names its buildings after donors and then discovers those donors have opinions about curriculum. A court is shaped across decades by appointments made by executives whose networks overlap in ways that seem unremarkable at the time. No single moment looks like a crisis. The temperature rises 1 degree at a time. The historians who documented the pornocracy were working in retrospect. From inside the process, the arrangement had a kind of logic. These were powerful families. Powerful families had always shaped Roman governance. What exactly was the alternative? The candlelight looked the same. The incense smelled the same. The liturgy proceeded on schedule. It took generations to name what had actually happened. The corridors of the Lateran Palace are quiet now. The Theophylacts are gone, scattered into the general sediment of medieval history. The reforms came eventually. The locks were installed. The windows were found, then reinforced. The institution survived, which is not nothing. But here is what the pornocracy leaves behind, more durable than any family name. It is a reminder that the institutions we treat as permanent, neutral, and self-defending are precisely the ones most vulnerable to the patient and the well-connected. Sacred spaces do not protect themselves. Neutral offices do not stay neutral by accident. Someone has to notice the temperature rising. The incense fades. The candles burn down. And the question the Theophylacts left carved into the wall of every powerful institution that came after them is a simple one. Who is watching the room?